Welcome to Liberated Land Use, where we're imagining a future in which land is not a tool of exclusion, extraction, or inequity, but a partner in justice, belonging, and abundance. Rooted in anti-racism, pro-Black and Indigenous principles, and a just transition framework, we're making room for transformational change, emboldening you to reclaim the policies and practices that shape your neighborhood, your city, and your life. We're your co-hosts, Yodit Mesvin-Johnson and Jessica A.S. Lita.
Welcome, everyone, to Liberated Land Use, our second session in a series of 6. And we are just getting started. Settle on in. Jess and I have some prompts for you. Great if you could add your name and pronouns into the chat. Also, the lands you're tuning in from, especially those of you outside of Michigan. And if you were with us in the last session or watched or listened since, what's something that really stuck with you from exclusion collusion? That was session 1. What stood out for you? And if you're new with us, another prompt to think about is, what comes to mind when you hear the phrase housing as a human right? Give y'all a second to drop into the chat, maybe take a breath, get yourself into space, and we're going to get going into today's session.
I want to appreciate folks that filled out the post-session survey last time. There were a couple of important pieces of feedback that we appreciate. I mean, we appreciated all of them, but a couple that we incorporated into this time was maybe talk a little less when we're asking for feedback in chat, and also help ground us in where we are in the conversation. So we're trying to reflect what we heard from y'all, and that is a pre-prompt to make sure to fill out the post-session survey this time as well, please. We'll send you the link at the end.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jess. I'm gonna
Can
keep
you
us.
please, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you please repeat the 2 questions that you'd like us to
Are
respond
you
to in the
not
chat?
seeing them on your screen right now?
Oh, sorry. I was looking directly into my own response in the chat and saying, there's something missing here. It's right in front of me. Thank you.
You're
Yeah.
welcome. And a great question. I'll put those in chat as well, Michelle. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. The difference between de facto and de jure racism. Right on. Yeah, Justin, appreciate that. Feels like a long time ago, but the very local history of segregation is something that we need to be reminded of. Indeed. What about housing as a human right? What comes up for folks there? Yes, Marcella. Aspects of segregation that's been documented and other parts that have been erased. Yeah. Go ahead and take a few more minutes. I'm going to move us along. Those who are in the Michigan region, we are on the Three Fire Confederacy land. And the state of Michigan and the United States government carried out genocide, ethnic cleansing, and forced removal against the Three Fires Confederacy as a way to acquire land. They broke promises made in treaties, and despite centuries of colonial theft and violence, we acknowledge this is still Indigenous land, and it will always be Indigenous land. Indigenous people are not relics of the past. They're here and continue to demonstrate their talents and gifts amidst a backdrop of ongoing colonialism and oppression. They're worth celebrating. And for us, land acknowledgement isn't, it's only a small part of supporting those communities. We hope that this work of LLU, we hope that our ongoing struggle with colonialism, separation, disconnection will inspire others to stand with us in solidarity with Native nations. And that can look like donating time and money to Indigenous organizations, amplifying their voices, investing in grassroots change movements, and of course, returning land. So we encourage you to make sure that your practice is in fact active. I briefly mentioned my name. Jess and I are co-founders of Future Root, where we catalyze people who are building cultural and economic and political power at the intersections of race, place, history, and culture, and folks who want to reimagine cities and create more just futures. So every first Thursday of the month between now and June, we'll be meeting here at noon. And then you can follow us, follow back and listen on our YouTube page, as well as engage in ongoing dialogue, conversation, resource sharing, community building on our Discord page. So please be sure, I know it's been dropped in the chat, if you've not already joined and you're intending to be an ongoing part of the community, there's lots of good stuff happening over there. Also, just want to shout out a couple other team members who aren't on this slide, but are integral to our work. Both Liz and Marcella are here. They are supportive engines of Future Root, and we're grateful for their time and labor. If you were with us last time, what you will see as an arc in LLU is what we characterize as our theory of change, the importance of reckoning with our racial history, of remembering the practices, the guidance, the wisdom, and the principles of folks who were building community power amid struggle. And that in that reckoning and in remembering that we are bringing that through in our reimagination of just cities and just futures. Last session, we talked about housing exclusion and housing as a tool of exclusion. So just wanted to bring you back from that or to that. And of course, our chat prompt gave us a moment of reflection. And thank you for the feedback. For a lot of folks, some elements of our last session, which featured Dr. Matthew Countryman, were a refresher. And for others, it was new information. We're going to continue learning and leaning in together throughout this series. Jess and I do not consider ourselves, the experts at the front of the room, but rather learners in community with you who are deeply committed to radically imagining new futures. So thank you for being with us. I'm going to stop sharing slides so me and my girl can get in some conversation.
And I look forward to this, and this is totally an extension of a conversation that we've been having for years with increasing intensity and investment and wondering about, like, what is it that we're coming into and why does it feel so disjointed? So I'm just so delighted to be having this conversation with you. It's post-birthday day, so I'm just going to keep celebrating that with you. And B, in this particular group, I'm really enjoying watching the comments coming through on chat. There's one that I want to lift up and come back to a little bit later. The comment separate from our first session. I saw the documentary about Letter to the West Side, which I thought was wonderful, but I was taken aback by some ranting on Nextdoor about it, saying they felt that because it was made by the Housing Commission, it was too little, too late, racist, and other things, definitely related to housing and land use. Thoughts? Great questions, dense. If it's okay, I'd like to come back to that a little bit later because it deeply ties into everything that we're talking about today. Excuse me. I also appreciate the nuance that's being brought into chat about your experiences with the phrase housing is a human right. Even the most aspirational and transformational idea can be a dog whistle if it's not backed up by a vision, a plan, and community work around it. I want to tie in what we're talking about today with where we started last week. The collusion and exclusion that we talked about last time speak to an underlying belief by the colonizers that they were entitled to land and to monetizing it and to extracting resources from it. They did not believe, as Native Americans did, that land was not owned, but that rather we are all stewards and that every person deserved shelter and well-being. With
I just want to
liberated
say
land
that
use.
again,
Mhm.
that the
Please.
context we're operating in is one in which the 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 violent colonization of this land also came along with the dehumanization of the people here and the commodification of the land that they were stewarding.
I appreciate you adding space to that. It always lands like a ton of bricks. And it always feels like there's so much to talk about that it's easy to rush past it.
Mhm.
So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Oh, and I think this is a container and a space for us to sit with multiple truths, the other or another being, that we get to envision together what radical housing justice can look like, right? And that it must include process as well as outcome. Because often community engagement processes, which let's be honest, it was that like terrible engagement processes were sort of the impetus for LLU, right? Along.
Yes, it's fine. I'm not triggered at all right now. It's fine. Everything's fine.
Yeah, so it's why we're focused today on, just ends require nonprofit means, and so often community engagement processes can be quite
Nonviolent.
violent. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
You've been in this space for a long time. Just kind of contextualize for us what the issue or the challenge is.
Mhm. I'll start by talking about my entry into this. There was a site in downtown Ann Arbor referred to colloquially as the library lot. It had the potential to turn into a lot of housing. This seemed like a slam dunk. The developer was going to not only develop housing, but give a lot of money to the Affordable Housing Fund. And I was very excited about it and thought nothing more of it until I understood that this was actually a contested issue in the community. And so I was like, okay, what do I do? And what I came to understand is that city council was in the process of making decisions about contracts related to that land. And I thought, okay, it seems to be my job to go and say what I know and believe to city council. It was nerve-wracking. My voice shook. I probably cried a little after. It took me a long time to figure out how to get into the building. And I wrote out and read what I wanted to say so I didn't forget any of the points. Excuse me. What I didn't really realize at the time is that while giving comment at a public meeting, including a public meeting with electeds, which is what that was, um, is a part of our participatory democracy, it's really muddy how much of a difference it makes. And it's not super clear to folks who are tuning into issues that affect us, whether that's development, whether that's sustainability, whether that's a new bike lane. It's really difficult to tell at what point a process is and which feedback of ours is going to be meaningful and to whom. Do we talk to staff? Do we talk to a consultant? Should I be talking to my neighbor? Should I be calling my city council member? There's this phrase that is both true and maddening that all politics is local, but the most opaque politics is local. It is hard to know what's going on and what to do about it. Since then, I have been in hundreds of community meetings in a variety of roles. I've been an activist and an advocate. I've been a nonprofit director. I've been on the board of the Downtown Development Authority. You and I convened some community engagement with the city of Ann Arbor. I've been a fly on the wall watching conversations unfold. And what has struck me in almost every single room, not 100%, but approaching that, is that these rooms are violent. The discourse is set up to be combative and abusive. And I say that as somebody who, you and I talk a lot about what healthy and generative conflict looks like, about what it means to hold multiple truths and productive and dynamic tensions. So when I say it's set up for this combative thing, it's not because I'm conflict averse. It's because it is combat for the sake of distraction, pointing us as weapons at each other, rather than all of us looking at these systems that are designed really to entrench an ongoing status quo.
Mm.
So that's what brings me into this chair today, is a frustration that as much as I deeply believe in accessible, affordable, abundant housing, I do not think we're going to be able to get there with our current process. And I think about that a lot.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jess. I think a lot about my experience of community engagement and its violence is that it's frequently used as an insurance policy.
Mm-hmm.
In my
Can you say
work.
a little more about that?
Yeah. So, a group of, I work in the social sector. So, a group of people come up with an idea and then they go, oh, we should, engage the community. And essentially what that is they want to have their idea endorsed by the community, but the idea has already been developed, already been fleshed out, plans have been put in place, budgets have been made. And so it's just to be able to sort of check a box. We engaged community, but there's very little flexibility or variability or ability to actually change the approach for community to say, oh, you have this idea, I don't like it, like I'd like you to change it, right? And so
Especially if the change desired is
is not,
transformational.
that's right, that's right. So that has been my experience. I don't know that I had the language for it, but I can think of, like you, many hundreds of times over the years of sitting in a conversation or being asked to come to a meeting and to give feedback, right? To contribute my time, my labor, my expertise, only to have that never show up in the end product. So I think not only is the system violent in that it is extractive, it is not often done in a way that values it's extractive and prescriptive. Thank you. Those are the perfect words, Ryan. But then the dynamic, for me at least, is even more layered because I am often invited into a space, so in an engagement process, so that whoever the hosting group is can say, we engaged Black folks. And I'm expected then to speak on behalf of an entire group of people, a very small fraction of whom I actually know. So not only is the process not necessarily generative, but the motivations behind engaging community are often to check a box and not because we really value the multiplicity of perspective and input that can come in a design process and can be really powerful. I want to say one other thing. You spent way more time in housing. You want to talk about governance? I can talk about governance. You want to talk about racial justice? I can talk about racial justice. You want to talk about economic justice? I can talk about economic justice. I know just enough about, sort of the nuance of housing in the and the policy of housing to get, just enough to get myself in trouble. And I'm learning. I'm on a learning journey, and I appreciate what I've learned from you. But I think something else that has been really bothersome to me, I remember giving public comment at, I don't know, it might have even been that meeting that you were talking about, but somebody had reached out and said, we're trying to get a thing passed, and can you come? And I sat in the audience and heard the words affordable housing over and over again, almost to the point of disgust, because it was like a coded language for how do we, you know, kind of let folks in. And by in, I mean to this white, wealthy bedroom enclave of a community that was itself created as a way to escape from the metropolis of Detroit and from people of color. So affordable housing for who? Like, and who are we talking about? And the reality is that in this county, it is Black and brown people who are most fragilely, most unhoused disproportionately, and most fragile when it comes to accessing housing. So I also want to say that these engagement processes are often happening at a level that's disconnected from the reality of what I see on the streets, right? At the Delantis Center, in, you know, the number of people who've been pushed to Ypsilanti, the number of folks who can no longer, including myself, afford to even live in this town. So who are we actually talking about building housing for?
That reminds me, this is a tiny bit of a tangent, but that reminds me, I was reading up more about the process that Oakland University has gone through and is going through to seed land, give land back, to seed land to local tribe and local tribal members, or actually statewide tribal members. But one of the very first actions that the advisory council requested that they take is that they just not mow and watch and see what happened.
That's right.
And one of the first things that happened was a daisy grew. And from that, and what ended up coming from that is watching to see which, thanks, Lisa, I appreciate that. Lisa dropped in the website for the project that I'm talking about, for the land that I'm talking about, for folks that are tuning in on YouTube and podcast. We will, of course, include the link in the show notes, so you've got access to that as well. But from the plants that started growing without interference, they were able to infer which insects were going to return, and then which lower level herbivores, and then omnivores, and then carnivores. So they were able to sort of construct a model of an entire ecosystem, starting with daisy. And I feel like we're not good at listening to daisies. And I mean that both literally and figuratively in our community. I've really been sitting with that imagery as both a metaphor and a literal process this week. I'm also thinking, Patricia, who's on this call right now, and I are in a anti-racist political organizing program called the Ann Braden Program. And our brief this week was to understand more about the Indigenous history and communities related to where we are. One of the things that I learned, and I feel like I should have known this, but I learned, is that Michigan, of course, had residential schools for children that were open as late as 1983. That's really sobering. Like, you and I were both alive when those residential schools were operating. I say all of that to say that in the interest of conducting community engagement, we're going to talk a little bit about intent versus impact in a moment. In the interest of trying to do this community engagement, we rush and we go fast and we check boxes at the expense of slowing down and listening in ways that tell us what and who the actual ecosystem are. Community engagement, the way that it is framed right now, is a relatively modern invention. The way that it looks governmentally, and I say that because Yodi, you and I have talked a lot about what real community engagement means, and the fact that it has existed uninterrupted for millennia. And I really appreciated you bumped my nose a little bit that day and you were 100% right. And you were like, no, what we're doing is not new. It's not revolutionary. Government just doesn't do it. Thank you. Appreciate that. But what we see is a result in part of work that came out of the 1960s and the 1970s. One thing I want to refer back to with Yodit and I both being in Michigan is the Port Huron Statement, which was a political manifesto written in 1962, authored by the Students for a Democratic Society, a student activist movement. This document and this group were a part of popularizing what we now call participatory democracy. It was around before, but it was more of a jargony phrase. Now it's something that a lot of folks use, and it's in part because of this document. I want to read an excerpt from the section on participatory democracy because this specific document helped bring that into mainstream discourse, culture, and practice. And I think indicting the impact requires looking at the intent, like what was it designed to do? The document was designed to be anti-racist and nonviolent, and explicitly anti-war. 1962 saw the birth of the Vietnam War. It saw the proliferation of nuclear weapons for the first time across the United States. At 1962, the United States was the only one to have the bomb, but that wasn't true for long. So I just want to frame that as the context in which this document was written. In a participatory democracy, the political life would be based in several root principles. And this is a verbatim excerpt from the document. That decision-making of basic social consequence be carried on by public groupings. That politics be seen positively as the art of collectively creating an acceptable pattern of social relations. That politics has the function of bringing people out of isolation and into community, thus being a necessary, though not sufficient, means of finding meaning in personal life. That the political order should serve to clarify problems in a way instrumental to their solution. It should provide outlets for the expression of personal grievance and aspiration. Opposing views should be organized so as to illuminate choices and facilitate the attainment of goals. Channels should be commonly available so that private problems, from bad recreation facilities to personal alienation, are formed as general issues. I appreciate deeply the aspirations of this document. I appreciate that it is attempts to ground in anti-racism and nonviolence. But what it absolutely fails to reckon with is that participatory democracy leans so heavily on the status quo. And we talked in the first section about how our current housing is built on 400 plus years of anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, segregation, and hierarchicalization. Participatory democracy tends to prioritize folks who are physically adjacent to an issue. Our current power structure tends to prioritize homeowners. It tends to be easier for retired folks to access. And so what we're doing is creating a system, has created a system that organizes so firmly in favor of folks who are already deeply enfranchised. We're also, oh, sorry, go ahead. And also you're on mute. Do you want to say something, Pepe? Okay.
I want to say all the things, but I'm gonna wait until you're done.
Another challenge with community engagement as it currently stands is that it's often stipulated as a requirement. So let's say specifically for housing, I'm not going to look at other kinds of community engagement right now, specifically for housing. There are certain requirements that are set at the state level. Whether you do it, to what radius you are required to talk to people, radius from within a number of feet within a specific site. So it's stipulated there. And there's also a challenge in that the way our community engagement processes are set up is that it's essentially done site by site and problem by problem. So that governing organizations, governing agencies have a deeply, by definition, transactional relationship with its community members rather than a relational one. It silos information. So if you're collecting information about housing, you may or may not be talking to people about the bike and road infrastructure that's intersecting with their homes. You may or may not be talking to people about sustainability infrastructure that's being considered for their neighborhood. And that makes sense because that's how the work is executed on the public side, on the staff side. But it makes for a really disjointed process on the community member side. And it also means that if you get involved in one thing, there's no guarantee that what you are contributing to, your voice that you're lifting up, the values that you're lifting up, the vision that you're lifting up, is going to translate to any, excuse me, microphone, going to translate to absolutely anything else in the city. So I wanted to start with the intentions of community engagement because the intentions are there, but they are also baked in a white supremacist hierarchical society and culture. So the impacts tend to reflect that as well. I have some things to say about that, but I'm going to pause and take a breath and just check in.
Yeah, this last sentence you made, I think is so powerful. When the work of movements is co-opted by government, nonprofits, any institution that in and of itself is steeped in the dominant culture, practices, and processes. And so the most well-intended process, the most well-intended effort when the culture, the practices, the mores, the policies are steeped in supremacist ideology, when then they run amok. And I think that's really important for you to uplift. It speaks to the failures of many systems, including in my world, nonprofits who are really well intended and trying to live into the aspirations of many movements over the arc of the centuries, of this country. And yet then we attach a structure that's inherently rooted in distrust, right? A board, and a staff, and, and we put in a reliance on, or what I said to a friend yesterday is like serving two masters. So you have funders and donors who have an agenda, right? And recipients or benefactors. So we do have to interrogate when we're trying to take something and apply it within that context without interrogating the structure itself. And we see that happen time and time again. So you talked about intent. I want to share a slide here and maybe have you talk more about, well, then what has been the impact of those intentions?
This one, it's not exactly dense, but it's really important. And Yodit said, we should really give people a little help in processing all of this. So this and the next slide are, I'm going to talk through it, but essentially verbally what we're reflecting is what you're seeing visually. So we've talked about the intent. The intent largely is good. The intent is aspirational. The intent is inclusivity. The assumed values at the very beginning are ones that I would say I largely agree with. I think that there was some unexamined biases inherent in it. To Karen Hart's point, a few comments up, generationally, we see some fractures, and we also see some deep fractures along class lines, which America is so bad at talking about, unfortunately. So the impact of some of these issues is false generalizability, that folks who are conducting these engagements assume community needs based on too few voices or responses. You've already spoken to tokenism, an undue burden of labor, responsibility, visibility put on Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, employees, stakeholders, community members. There's this sense of urgency where we're prioritizing fast results or time-bound results over true allyship and visible results over long-term change. And power hoarding. It is not a true shared governance. And there's an assumption by each group in a room that most of the others are ill-informed.
Mhm.
That system of distrust, I really appreciate you bringing up nonprofits into it, because that, staff, directorship, board, funders relationship is essentially one of distrust. I
And
am,
all linked to carcerality, right? Or like these
yes,
punitive and either
yes.
or, yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
thinking.
Yeah. I want to lift up a comment in a couple of comments that I'm seeing in the chat, because it's right up this alley and speaks to
Mhm.
something that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a moment. One person
Mhm.
says, I've attended a lot of meetings as a community member and activist, and I'd say that most of them are horror shows in one way or another. Recently, I went to one discussing a seemingly very minor issue and found out to my surprise that an old friend was the loudest and angriest voice for the opposite position of mine. This really underlines my Jess's description about the way we do community environment engagement being a form of violence. Not only can it set strangers against each other, in this case, it nearly ruined a friendship. And I would say these rooms really kind of condone these interactions. There's another comment that says, as someone who witnessed / was peripherally involved with the community engagement process around removing the Confederate statues in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2016, and they take care to name prior to the Unite the Right rally, they have a bit of PTSD walking into a public meeting. And I think there are a bunch of us who
Oh my,
having
like raise your hand if you if
I
you
need more
have
hands.
a PTSD from community engagement meetings. Yeah.
I mean, you
Yeah.
really only need to have been in one or two to start walking into them with a twitch. That
Mhm.
means it's broken and it's functioning by design.
Well, and I think that, we often talk about community engagement, but who's disengaging and
Mhm.
why? And
Yeah.
rarely do we talk to folks. I mean, not only like this piece around power hoarding and not having true shared governance also manifests itself in like who sets the meeting time and how long the meeting goes and who is informing that. Like, if community engagement is we hung the shingle out, if you come great you're in, and if you don't you're not. That too is a form of power hoarding, and often the reason folks don't show up, not because they don't care, but I can't stay at the city council meeting until midnight with a small child as a single
Mhm.
mom. Who's
Mhm.
going to take care of my kid, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Let's talk about more impacts.
I'm just sitting with the feelings because they're so big. As an advocate, as an activist, as an organizer, I have such a deep aspiration for community engagement to live up to its aspirations, and it just right now it mostly doesn't. Community engagement requires, especially as stipulated by law, are a checklist, not a commitment or any kind of contribution to a relationship. Project-based community engagement is transactional, it's not relationship. And project-based community engagement silos information and it sidelines community members who are
Mhm.
not already enfranchised and engaged.
Absolutely.
So this conversation, we're kind of bumming everybody out about community engagement. And I got to tell you right now, like, this is not the conversation for the light at the end of the tunnel. Keep coming to liberated land use. We have a lot more to talk about. But this one, we just really wanted to spend time in defining what's happening and the issue. And if you don't mind taking this down, I want to go into the last thing that I want to say about this, which is that community engagement as it exists right now, especially for public projects, especially for housing, it is intrinsically and by definition inaccessible and violent. On the process side, it's inaccessible because there is such a huge distance between what we're doing in these rooms on the ground and how policy is formed, or even the process of how policy is formed. I believe in good process. I believe in due process, but I believe that our public process typically functions as alienating and distancing rather than bringing folks closer and more proximate to not just the problem, but the root of the problem.
Mm.
The process is violent in that we are setting up the public, when we are setting up public, engagement, we are failing to account for multiple publics, right?
Mhm.
I
Right.
mean, you spoke to this earlier when folks reach out to you and they're like, "You're Black. Can you please speak to for all Black people so that we don't have to talk to anybody?" And you're like, "Have you met more than one Black person? Because we're none of us are the same." And that's true. And I'm not saying that there are not ways to set up representative communities, but I'm saying mostly we don't even aspire to do that. I mean, if we're talking about the class line, how hard and how do we work to engage folks at and just above poverty? It's hard.
Or folks who are, who have disabilities,
Folks who
or,
have disabilities, that's right.
folks who don't have formal education and don't know all the lingo. There are a number of ways in which these processes are exclusive, and inherently violent. There's some, I want to just acknowledge the number of people, if not almost everybody in this space, that have named um, really difficult experiences. And Jess and I are trying to both interrogate the systems. I like to say we're soft on people and hard on systems. So I want to be clear that the the systems are working as they were intended. And over time, it will be our collective work to break them, but to continue tinkering in them, which to some degree is what, you know, refined community engagement process. So I'm in the room because somebody said there's no Black people in the room. So then they were like, oh, well, let's call, some Black folks, or let's call some queer
Mhm,
folks, or let's call some disabled folks, or let's call some poor folk.
mhm,
What hasn't been said is we actually cannot create a just city without designing with those folks in the center. And
mhm.
not to, spill the tea, but that's where we're going.
Oh no, you gave it all away.
Can I talk just briefly about, because I mentioned like our curiosities about this being a reason for LLU, but the other was, I don't live in Ann Arbor, but I work in Ann Arbor, lots of my clients in Ann Arbor, and just briefly want to name that Ann Arbor's comprehensive land use process, also known as a master plan, has been going on for this entire time. And um, I suspect, and most of my experience so far has proven this to be the case, that that process is largely missing the voices of those folks who would want to uh, access the benefits, the intended benefits of the plan. And it's not because there isn't a robust effort to engage in place. Um, there are many factors that are inhibiting that process from being more inclusive, and a lot of them lie in what you've been talking about.
Well, and I'll name, I had an opportunity a few years ago to present to uh, group of transportation engineers a couple of years
Mhm.
ago, and on the challenges of community engagement. And it was me not telling them anything that they didn't know. I was naming a lot of the challenges that they experience. And one of those challenges is that the amount of time for community engagement is stipulated by the budget,
Yep, that's right.
typically before the project is even handed over.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of an opportunity to create a relationship with constituents and constituencies,
Mm-hmm.
we have to show up to a room with a whiteboard and a folding table and a whole bunch of post-its because we've only got an hour and a half.
Right, right.
I want to talk a little bit more about inaccessibility and violence, and then I don't know how, but we are already in the last 10 minutes of our
Mhm.
conversation. If folks have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I also want to return to the comment a few minutes ago about the documentary and the response to the documentary. So we're going to try to address the comments that we can. So I mentioned the inaccessibility and violence of the process, but I also want to talk about the language that we have in most of these rooms. First of all, it's typically inaccessible. I cannot have a conversation that involves the phrase land use without the person that I'm talking to immediately their eyes glaze over. And I empathize. I get it. It affects all of us, and I want us all to know more about it and like have huggy feelings about it. And like, let's all talk about it in Sesame Street terms. That's not where we're at right now. And when we talk about zoning, when we talk about AMI, when we talk about floor area ratio, when we talk about all of these things, it's kind of hit or miss in community engagement rooms, whether those terms are not just defined, but brought proximate to the folks that are actually in the room.
They're not. There's an assumption that you know them
Right.
when you go in.
And I want to
Mhm.
say almost always, because I have been in a couple of rooms where it was done beautifully.
Mm,
And you feel it, like you feel it in your body. You are part of the team. You're welcomed in there. Like my nervous system settles down. Excuse me. So there's inaccessibility, which is a challenge. But there's also the violence of the language that they use in this room. And, you know, one of the commenters referred to this a few minutes ago. And this is in almost every public community meeting ever. I mean, even in Ann Arbor, which likes to consider itself a bastion of civility, I don't want to tell you to do this, but I am going to say it out loud. Spend 5 minutes in a school board meeting. It
mm,
is one of the most abusive rooms you will ever be in from any of the constituents. And part of the challenge is that due to the desire to seem quote unquote objective and like they aren't favoring one group or one individual over another, facilitators of public meetings often can't or won't redirect when that meeting starts to derail. And this is traumatic for the facilitators as well. Every single person, without exception, I can say this confidently, who has public or community engagement experience has at least one horror story. Some of us, and I would unfortunately put myself in this camp, the majority of our experience is a horror story. I'm not even going to talk about how much I've talked about community engagement in therapy. It's very helpful, by the way.
mm,
There's a lot of reasons why participants feel entitled to abuse one another. Part of it is that we feel like we are yelling into a room that does not want to hear our voices. And so frequently the yelling becomes not just metaphorical, but literal. But rather than be frustrated that we are frequently invited to rooms too little, too late, asked questions that are much too small, we turn that frustration, that entitlement, that desire to be heard on one another.
mm,
So I just want to continue to emphasize that we are all set up to fail, whether it's public servants, whether it's elected officials, whether it's community members, whether it's activists. We are being set up to be in combat with each other,
mm.
because it distracts from the fact that we are not really being given the option to even talk about housing as a human right, right? Coming back to the very beginning. Excuse me. I want to check in on chat. I also want to check in with you, Yodi, to see if there's anything else that we want to talk about before.
I want to give over, I mean, we'll talk about how folks can follow along and what's coming up next, but I want to give over a little bit of room for questions, thoughts, feelings from those who are with us. And the chat has been active. Teresa, there is no life within, there is no right life within in the wrong one. Mm. Um, in Ypsilanti, the majority of public engagement is very violent. Jess, do you want to respond to the person talking about the next door comments on the film and such?
So first of all, let us name that next door is set up to inflame our worst impulses. And it ties it to our deeply held identity about what our address means about ourselves. So next door in some ways is, it can be, and in my experience frequently has been, the worst part of every community engagement meeting ever. There is no discernment for race, class, power analysis. There's frequently ahistorical and very acontextual conversations being had on there. And it's easy and rewarded to be yelly rather than thoughtful, and to be critical instead, in the sense of criticizing, over critical in the sense of engaging with judgment and discernment. So I just want to.
Can I just say something real quick on that? Because
Please.
I think it's a little more nuanced than that. Like
It is.
it reinforces individualism under the
Mm,
guise of a community connection, but it
mm,
really reinforces, like, even the way you connect with people. So
mhm,
just another artifact of
mhm.
individualism and supremacy.
Yeah, and thank you for putting it that way. I appreciate it.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to wrap a huge asterisk around the fact that this was happening on Nextdoor. But I also want to address the criticism about the fact that because it was made by the Housing Commission, it was too little, too late, too racist, and other things.
It was
Uh,
not made by the Housing Commission, to be
it
clear. It was
it was
made
not.
by Black filmmakers and
That's right.
producers.
Thank you.
Yes,
And what I wanted to address is the fantastic erasure of
that's
that
right.
criticism by the folks that actually made this, participated in it, and lifted up. So I would pay more attention to who all was involved with it and less attention to the fact that the Housing Commission did put some dollars towards it, did have some things to do with
Right,
it. I'm not going to say they
right.
didn't, but like be really careful in your criticisms about the erasure that you may be perpetuating. So I wanted to put that. Lex next door is Law and Order writ large. That's never gonna not be funny. Which film, please? Letter to the West Side, recent documentary. I understand it's going to be archived on the Ann Arbor District Library website later this year. There's a trailer up and available on YouTube about it.
And we'll add it to Discord too, you
Well,
all. We'll be sure to do that.
so we're here. We have
Yeah.
come to not the end of the conversation, but the end of our lunch hour together. This conversation never really ends. And y'all, I really want to see you over in Discord. A, I want to trade horror stories with you. But B, I don't want to get stuck there. I would love to hear about positive stories. I have a couple of myself to share. And I would also love to hear your ideas. What you think today a community engagement could be doing, what you'd like
Mm-hmm.
community engagement to feel like.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing. Yodit dropped in the post-session survey into the chat. If you could, it just takes a couple of minutes. Please fill it out today. We will also put it in the follow-up email, also put it in the Discord, so you'll have multiple opportunities, but hey, why not do it right now? No problem.
Mm-hmm.
Would love to see you over in the Discord, and this visual will be available on YouTube next week. And we have started putting the audio out. So anywhere you get your podcasts, if you sign up for Liberated Land Use, you'll find us immediately, and that'll be there as well. I'm wondering.
Jess, can I tell the people a little bit about what to expect? Larry, I just dropped it in chat.
Mhm, mhm.
You were saying you're wondering, and I was saying I want to tell people some things.
I want you to tell people some things.
Thank you. Just want to remind us of the sessions. So last month we had our grounding. This month we're talking about language. Next month, governance. In May, being in right relationship with the land, and in June in talking about power. We know that there isn't near enough time to unpack all of this in this hour lunch. And so please accept our invitation to come on over to Discord. Also, the feedback really helps Jess and I to think about the design of the session. So I'd love to see, all of you complete that. It should take maybe 5 minutes or so. And we will see you back here on in April. My gosh. Where does the time go?
Third, I think, right? Is that
Yeah, I
real?
think I want to get it right. I don't want to tell you wrong. Yeah, April 3rd, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, April 3rd at noon, right here. Any final thoughts from folks that are with us today? Questions, thoughts, something you're holding, maybe something you're taking away with you?
Michelle?
Yeah. I had a plug for something, so if someone has a reflection, I'd let them go first.
Let's do that, and I'll probably also stop the recording, so we can capture it.
Mm.
Patricia? Oh, Beth. Sorry, the thing popped up over your face.
I'm not really organized in this conversation. I'm also thinking of like the step back from housing to land ownership and the way that we weaponize land ownership in our culture, but in Western dominant culture continuously as this measure of success. But the like idea of land tenure as being the only mechanism that one can show that they have the right to participate in economy. And we do that in our country and export it globally. Um, and that's on my heart.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that goes to the core of why participatory democracy is failing, is that idea of land tenure as status marker.
I also bet Jess and I have had this conversation because it is also tied to wealth generation. And so for, spaces that I'm in, the idea of home ownership is really reparative, that the promises of Lincoln of 40 acres and a mule to freed enslaved Africans was a way to, in at least a promise of a way to build safety for your family and to build economic empowerment, right? And so it's fraught. And I think that is why somebody noted in the comment, like, we've talked about all these, housing is a human right, but and rarely do we actually see how we can get there. But I think in if it is still tethered to preservation, to how you care for, your family, how you ensure that your descendants are cared for, and then we have more to do to unpack that and um, to create all other alternatives for doing that. I think that's what I want to say. All right, I feel a natural pause, but Michelle, come on and give us the tip. What you got?
Okay, so I wanted to let you all know that the March 11th at 6 p.m. at Michigan Theater, there is a free event for a documentary that's been traveling around the US. The Housing Commission, the city, and several schools at the University of Michigan are co-sponsoring. Also, the county, Avalon, there are several sponsors, but it is about the root causes and potential solutions of homelessness. And so I can put the details in the Discord, but I wanted to let you all know this touches on some of the topics we are talking about, and it is a free event to learn more about housing.
Excellent. You can drop it in the chat too, Michelle. And thank you. If others have relevant resources like this, please do continue adding them, and let's make sure other folks know about them.
I'll say we can stay on for a few more minutes, but for the sake of YouTube and podcast, we can wrap up the conversation. Dee, we've been having this conversation for years. We're going to keep having it for years, but I really appreciate it today.
Yeah, I appreciate you as well, all of you being here.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. That's it for this episode of Liberated Land Use. We're your co-hosts, Yodit Mesfin-Johnson and Jessica A.S. Lita. Deep thanks to team members Liz Trudeau, Marcella Omans-McKeeby, and Justin Schell for making everything look and sound as good as it does. To contact us, email hello@futureroot.co. Our theme music is CS Music by Chandrakant Shinde. See you next time on Liberated Land Use.